For the last section of this chapter, we're going to talk about something that we haven't really addressed yet. This is the concept of where these measures of personality are actually coming from. So we're going to look at a bunch of different types of personality assessments. The first thing I want to discuss are two very important terms when evaluating how useful or how beneficial a particular measurement is going to be. And these terms are reliability and validity. Reliability refers to the consistency of a measure. So if we have a consistent measurement, you should be scoring fairly similarly on that test each time you take it. So if it is reliable, you're going to get a consistent score. There are lots of different types of reliability, but we're going to focus on test-retest reliability. And this is the idea where you should have the same reliable score over time. So you have consistency in your scores across time. So each time you test and retest a particular score, you should be getting a fairly similar number. For validity, we're looking at how accurate a measure is. So is this measure actually getting at what you think that you're measuring? So we're looking at if you're using a test properly. So if we've set up a personality test, is it actually getting at and measuring personality, or is it focusing in on something else? So what we can see here is that we can have a test that is reliable but may not be valid. But if it lacks reliability, it's also not going to be valid. So if you were trying to figure out someone's personality, if you were trying to get a measurement of someone's personality, how do we go about doing this? You can ask them, you can ask others, you can have tests that you could conduct, you can have questionnaires, you can observe their behavior, and to get a good description of personality, you kind of end up having to do a little bit of all of those. One of the first things, at least I think about when I think about assessing personality, are personality quizzes. So if somebody gave you a survey and asked you, from a scale of 1 to 10, how much do you agree with the following statements? And those statements were related to, say, the factors we talked about for our Big Five, or for the 16 factors of personality, or even the 2-factor personality model. So you could have questionnaires or interview data where you can evaluate how this person thinks in regards to different statements that line up with different traits that we're interested in. Now, if you remember back to earlier on in this course, we had talked about the fact that survey data or interview data isn't necessarily the most reliable thing, because we're relying on an interview to just tell us what's going on, which coincidentally, I have a slide for this. So you can have a structured set of standardized questions, you can have a pre-selected set of questions you want to ask. You can also note other types of behaviors, things like their appearance or speech patterns or other things that are going on, but you run into some drawbacks. So with in-person interviews, characteristics of the person doing the interviewing can affect the answers. As an example, imagine that you're being interviewed by a very attractive researcher. Maybe you don't want to answer a question in a way that makes you look bad because this person's really attractive and you want to look good in front of them. So the qualities of that interviewer is influencing how you're responding. In more broad terms, these interviews are dependent on the person who's answering the questions to be cooperative and honest, which isn't always the case. Whether it be through trying to look good in front of someone or not wanting to admit to our own shortcomings, interviewees can be uncooperative or misleading in their responses. If we want to do something like a behavioral assessment, we have another couple of things that we need to consider. Things like requiring an explicit coding system, a set of rules that tell the people who are doing the coding exactly how to code the behaviors that they're observing. It's Your goal here is not just to describe the behavior. You're trying to capture as much detail about the behavior as possible. So the specifics of the behavior, the frequency of the behavior, specific situations in which it's occurring and under what conditions it's happening. You want to get a complete picture and get as much information about this behavior as possible. And this focus on an explicit coding system isn't just so that you have a good description of what it is that you're observing. We're also aiming to have high interjudge reliability. Basically, if more than one person is going to be doing the coding, you want to make sure that the people doing that coding are highly trained. So your judges are very well trained and consistently trained to use that very explicit, very detailed coding system. And if they're very well trained and they're following the same set of rules, you should end up with high levels of agreement between those observers. Your judges should consistently give the same observations, the same scoring to the exact same kinds of behaviors. So you want that kind of consistency so that you know that your results are more reliable. We can use a special kind of behavioral assessment called remote behavioral sampling to get at some details that we might otherwise miss. These methods may involve things like whenever you receive a text from the researcher, you record what you're thinking about or what you're doing. Earlier on, it would have been tied to something like timers or even pagers, but now with large numbers of people having cell phones in their pockets, it's fairly easy to have a notification pop up and you answer the questions that are given to you at that particular time. These kinds of methods are really helpful because they allow us to sample behavior at random times over periods of either days or weeks or even months and years. So you don't have to be watching people all hours of the day, every day. So you have a better chance of getting a more complete picture of what their behavior is like long term without actually having to watch them long term. And this allows you to collect data on behavior that might not otherwise be revealed. On the remote side of things, this method of behavioral sampling allows us to look at what people are doing when they're outside of the lab or when they're outside of the interview. So what are you doing when you're going about living your life when you're notified to report your behavior or note your feelings or something like that? Similar to our interview questions, you could also use something like a personality scale. These are objective measures where you have a set of standardized questions that you can ask the participants, and they have to respond according to some scoring key or some kind of scale. So these questions are usually either true-false, or on a scale of 1 to 10, how much do you agree? Or a scale of 1 to 5, how much do you agree? These are the kinds of questions that you would see if you were doing some kind of personality quiz. Maybe you're doing a BuzzFeed quiz and they're asking you a bunch of questions to figure out your personality. That would fall under a personality scale, though I would question the validity of those tests just because of the source. So the advantages of proper personality scales, sometimes called personality inventories, is that you can collect a large amount of data in a fairly short time. Especially with the ability to put these online now, you can get hundreds and hundreds of people responding to these surveys, and you get lots and lots of data about their personalities based on how they answer those questions. Our disadvantages come back to the validity of the answers that they're giving. Did they truthfully answer the questions? Again, back to just how these kinds of studies are conducted, you're relying on the individual who's reporting their answer to give you a truthful response. Do they actually agree that they are an outgoing person, or do they just think that it's more appealing to be an outgoing person, or do they just want to be an outgoing person? You're not quite sure if they've answered truthfully, whether it be because they're intentionally lying or maybe they just don't know. You can use something like a validity scale to try and weed out those untruthful answers. So maybe you would ask some of the questions twice, once framed in a positive manner and once framed in a negative manner. If the person answers the question the same way each time, then you might be a little bit more confident that they're answering truthfully. You can also use these flipped questions as a means to detect patterns in responses. If somebody is answering 1,000 personality questions, maybe they get lazy halfway through and they're being untruthful, not because they're outright lying or trying to appear good in a certain light. Maybe they're just tired and they're answering neutrally on each and every question. Or maybe they're answering at one of the extremes on each and every question. So these validity scales can help you pinpoint those patterns and weed out any invalid or untruthful responses. Now, if you're trying to develop one of these personality scales, if you're trying to put together the items that you want to ask in these tests, there are two major ways that people can go about developing those scales. There's a rational method and an empirical method. For the rational method, you may choose to ask things that are based on your own idea of the trait of interest. So you pick items that seem relevant to the trait that you're looking at. So if you're trying to tell the difference between an introvert and an extrovert, you might ask yourself, well, how do introverts and extroverts differ? Well, I know that introverts are withdrawn and individual, whereas extroverts like to be in groups and are outgoing. So maybe I'll ask a question that would differentiate between their outgoingness versus their preference for being alone. The NEOPI is a measure of trying to get at the big 5 personality traits, and it was developed using this rational method, where people looked at the 5 different continuums of personality and decided that there were questions that would fit each of those different continuums. The other method, the empirical method, is actually put together not because the questions that you've chosen seem relevant to the trait of interest based on your theoretical understanding of that trait, but because previous research has already shown that the items are answered differently by the different groups of interest. An example of a test set up this way is the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, the MMPI, specifically version 2. And this is the most widely used personality inventory. And it's made up of a bunch of true-false questions that people who fall into one group tend to answer true, and who fall into another group would answer false. So by looking at hundreds of different questions and how people answer each of those, you can start figuring out where they fall in this personality inventory. And since this is the most commonly used personality inventory, we can talk just a little bit more about what it's made up of. So it has 10 clinical scales that were originally intended to measure personality deviations, things like depression, schizophrenia, and psychopathic personalities. And those questions and scales still get at those questions, or still get at those types of personality deviations, but the patterns of how people answer those same questions also gives us some insight into their personality. This inventory also includes 3 validity scales, which are used to detect tendencies to either present an overly positive picture or exaggerate your degree of psychological disturbance. Again, because this scale was originally designed to assess people and their psychological disturbances, there are protective mechanisms in place that helped with the original intent of this questionnaire. And now that we're using it for other factors, for other methods, We can use it to get a feel for personality in people who don't have the disorders that it was originally designed to detect. And nowadays, we're using this particular test as a screening device for different industrial positions and military settings. You can figure out how people function and whether or not they would succeed in a particular setting. For an example of an MMPI profile, the textbook provides that of Jeffrey Dahmer, who was a convicted mass murderer. And so we can see that he scored very high on things like psychopathic deviant, showing that he has severe levels of psychological disturbance. We can also see that he scored high in things that were related to schizophrenia or hypomania, even depression, where anything above a score of 65, where this dashed line is showing a significant deviation from what they would consider normal. So there are quite a few points here where this mass murderer scored high in terms of psychological abnormality. Our next type of assessment are the projective tests. And these are really interesting because these tests are presented with ambiguous stimuli. The results of these kinds of tests would be particularly interesting to Freud and other psychodynamic theorists because of their emphasis on the importance of unconscious factors. So the idea here is that if the stimulus that's being presented is ambiguous, if there is no overt meaning, then the interpretation of this neutral or ambiguous stimulus might serve as a projection of the inner needs, feelings, or ways that the individual is viewing the world. So this might be an expression of their unconscious. And so two of the main types of projective tests are Rorschach Inkblots and thematic apperception tests. So you're probably familiar with Rorschach Inkblots, where individuals will be presented with 10 ink blots at a time, and they don't necessarily look like anything. They're just blobs of ink. Sometimes in single colors, you might just see them in black. Sometimes they'll look like this, where there are multiple different colors. And you ask the person, what does this look like? And after the individual answers what they think it looks like, you might follow up and ask them, what part of this image made you think that? So the examiner is supposed to write down exactly what the responder says. They're also supposed to make note of how the subject is acting, any gestures they make, their mannerisms, their attitude, all sorts of things like that. And then they're going to categorize their responses based on what did they see and why did they see that. So are individuals paying attention to the whole ink blot? Are they focusing on just one aspect of it? Are they paying attention to the color, the shape? What part of it made them think that it was whatever they said it was? You might see the major problem with these ink blot tests where different examiners might have different interpretations. A bunch of different examiners looking at the same responses or looking at the same person's interpretation of an ink blot might have different ideas of what it means. There was an attempt to try and standardize how these Rorschach Inkblot responses are interpreted, and using this fairly recent system, it was developed in 2005 according to the textbook, you do tend to see good inter-rater reliability, so there's a lot less variability between examiners. But despite this, because of the ambiguity of these results, and maybe even just how it's viewed from the public, the use of Rorschach tests is declining. The second type of these tests are the thematic apperception tests, where individuals are shown ambiguous illustrations or photos and asked to tell a story about what they see. Though these images tend to be less ambiguous than the Rorschach tests, they are still more ambiguous than normal photographs. So the one here, for example, you're not quite sure what's going on. There are two people. What's happening? And so the themes of the stories that the interviewees tell are then analyzed. So themes that pop up repeatedly might be thought to be indicative of that person's current state of mind or their view of the world. If you constantly see an off-screen threat or something that's going wrong or something that's bad, then you might assume that the person being interviewed is in a negative state of mind, that they're constantly worried and they're always cautious of things that they don't know. We again run into this issue of non-standardized and subjective interpretations of responses. But when, again, standardized systems are put into place, the outcomes of these kinds of tests can be fairly useful in figuring out information about people's personality. Now, to wrap everything all together, we've had a whole chapter talking about personality theories, and we're just finishing up here talking about personality assessments. How do we fit it all together? The theories that we talked about throughout this chapter all provide a framework, a way of interpreting the information that we're looking at. So are you focused on the cognitive aspects? Are you focused on the unconscious part of personality? Your theory that you're working from sets the framework for how you're going to start interpreting things. Our personality assessment is giving us the tools to go about doing this. Personality assessment is how we measure different aspects of personality that we might then interpret using the framework that our theory has given us. And so even though it's a good idea to view lots of different perspectives and lots of different tools to get a more complete view of personality, we can start seeing that some of the tools that we've talked about go very nicely with some of the perspectives that we talked about. So our psychodynamic perspective lines up very nicely with our projective techniques. Humanistic perspective would go along well with self-report measures. Social cognitive perspectives line up with our behavioral assessments. Biological perspectives would go well with physiological measurements, which we didn't talk too much about, but that would be things like measuring brain activity or heart rate or things like that. And trait theorists would really like things like our personality inventories.